Happy Sunday, everyone. It's September 1st, 2024. You're watching Co-op for Two. We're here to read the third letter of four in a Dear Holmes case called the Celtic or Celtic Curse. The third and final story letter, fourth letter, will be the solution from Holmes. YouTube says 12 concurrent viewers, 4 likes. It's 1:04 p.m. Let's check in with the chat. I was thinking maybe we should, there's some YouTube channels that have very regular, like weekly chats, discussions, just updates. I try to do a channel update every 3 months or so. But we spend a little bit of time at the beginning of every stream just chatting a little bit. But I was thinking maybe the Sunday streams are even more appropriate for spending a couple minutes at the beginning just catching up with everyone. A couple people in the Discord for this channel have been talking about theories of this case. I'm not sure how I would rank this case compared to the others. It started out very strong, like very compelling mystery, but I feel like we've had a hard time grabbing anything solid in this case. It all feels very ephemeral and like there's not much, there aren't strange things to explain in this case, which is weird. Normally there are some facts that seem irreconcilable. I'm not sure that's the case here. But I did write down a couple of notes based on discussion in the Discord that we can talk about before we get started. A little bit of bookkeeping. First, last week we finished playing War Story Occupied France, which is right behind me there. And we had a 8.5-hour serious final session of Mission 3. I won't tell you what happened, except that we replayed it the next day, Friday, for another 4 hours and replayed a couple other stuff just to look at how the replayability was and different branching paths. And, well, I think very highly of the game. Today I recorded my review of it. My first review of 2. I'll probably do 2. The first one I'll try to make short, but it'll probably be 20 or 30 minutes. And then the second one, I'll focus only on game design issues, because there are a number of issues, game design issues in War Story that I think are quite notable and worth talking about. What else should we talk about? It's Labor Day. Maybe we'll play something on Monday. Let me know if you want to play something. The Discord is a good place to talk about if there's a game you want to play, a schedule you want to play. And the Board Game Geek Guild for this channel, there's a game queue thread where we're talking about. And I added a couple new games to it. I picked up we've been on a sort of time travel kick lately, playing these 2 Undo games that I decided we should try the Time Stories series, the new Time Story series. I wasn't a big fan of the original Time Stories, but the theme of this last one, you can see this Cavendish behind me, which is sort of like a haunted house time travel story, has got me reinterested. So I'd be interested in trying that, as well as a couple other games that I just picked up. Crypto Killer, and we've got another Masters of Crime game to play. And I picked up this book, You've Been Summoned, which looks like a big, elaborate, long book that's like a cold case game. So maybe we'll take a look at that at some point. Someone was asking if we'd play another Dear Holmes game. Another Deadbolt Mystery Society game soon. As we approach October, we'll start getting into some more spooky, scary deluxe games, which we like to do on this channel. Okay, looks like it's Teresa's birthday. Everyone's wishing Teresa a happy birthday. Deduction Club is here. Deduction Club is a guy who's been working on a new play-by-mail Sherlock Holmes game. Any updates on that you want to talk about and share? How is the progress going? I've been working very hard on the software tools for High and Low, the mystery game I've been working on, now renamed to New York Noir. And I've been rewriting the main tool, which has taken me over a month and been quite much more painful than I thought. But I've passed the worst of it, and now it's getting enjoyable again. Always looking for more programmers and writers who want to join the team and work on this case. I have a little note file for story ideas. I got a good one yesterday reading a book called Amaze and Amuse, a book about writing fiction as if you were writing puzzles. I'm not loving the book, but I got a couple ideas that went into my notes file. I'd like to do more sessions talking about mystery game writing and story writing for mysteries, but that will have to wait. If you're in the Champaign area, on September 7th and 8th, there's a local mini board game convention here called Tabletop Central. I will be there both days with High and Low or New York Noir, and I'll be running it. There are a couple people who've signed up to play it, but I'll be there outside of those hours as well if you want to play it or just talk about writing cases for it, etc. Okay, anything else to talk about before we get started? There was another little YouTuber controversy recently. I just watched Paul Grogan's, who runs a YouTube channel called Gaming Rules. He just put out a video talking about this recent YouTube board game reviewer who's gotten in trouble for taking a prototype that a designer sent them, charging for reviews, but then not sending it back. It was pretty ugly. And big long thread on Board Game Geek if you want to read about it. But it's sort of the classic thing that we keep seeing where board game content creators are charging for reviews, charging hundreds of dollars, and gets ugly where they're like trying to do a very aggressive pitch to get paid to do these reviews or playthroughs or how-tos or package deals. There's all kinds of scammy adjacent stuff that goes on in the board game YouTube world, and some of it is really blatant. Some of it is just not so blatant, but stuff that that is just not ethical in any other field. Like of this very common thing where a channel will do paid Kickstarter previews, and then they'll also just happen to do some unpaid reviews of the game and playthroughs or paid playthroughs. And then they get, like, Rob Oren is auctioning off thousands of games every month that are review copies that he gets. It's all pretty distasteful. The only thing that gives me pause in terms of complaining about it is I'm sensitive to the idea that you don't want to be in a situation where the only people who can make these who can have a board game channel are people who have a healthy income from some other source and plenty of disposable time. You sort of would like some people want to devote their full time to this, although that feels like a really unpleasant way to make money. But anyway, you'd like people who really want to spend their time doing it to have some ethical way of getting financial compensation. I am on the record very loudly saying there is a good path forward. It's not a path to make a good living, but there is an ethical path to being funded, and that's the people on YouTube and the artists who are getting funded directly by the people watching the content, and that's through something like Patreon, which is what we do here. Now I get about $96 a month from a handful of very kind Patreons to this channel, and I really appreciate it. It helps pay for the games here. Now, there are people who make a good living off Patreon, and that's the approach, that's the ethical approach I suggest to someone who really wants to make YouTube their living. I don't advise it. It seems like a long shot, but that is an ethical path. And then there are other ethical paths of different forms. One, it would be to take advertising not related to board games. But this whole system where these board game reviewers are getting all chummy with the publishers, and they're doing half their videos are paid content and half of them are not paid content, but happen to be for the same content, so that everyone is sort of rubbing each other's back. It's really unfortunate. And I am just so grateful not to be anywhere near that stuff. Every night I go to sleep thinking how happy I am to have such a good group of people to join me for these playthroughs. And we're doing it for fun. And those that can afford to support the channel through Patreon, very much appreciated, but nothing changes on this channel one way or the other. Okay. So, Dear Holmes, let's get started here. That's the other thing I keep meaning to mention. Jason Perez at Shelf Stories did a video a while. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this subject before we move on. Did a video where he interviewed a couple of people in the video game review industry. And one of them was saying, like, Jason Perez and the other person was like, well, it's okay to take review copies and do some paid Kickstarter. And the guy who is in traditional media said, no, you can't do any of that. It's not ethical. It's not in the code of ethics for a journalist, for a reviewer, to have any relationship. You can't be all chummy and review the things of your friends. So we're in this YouTube world is the ethics here are very thin, and they're like the lowest rung of ethics of any real media. And I think we can do better. Now, I was blinking because I was trying to remember something. Rob says, I appreciate that there are no ads or sponsorships on this channel. Yes, I turn off ads for all the videos. There are no ads on any of the videos, at least in my control. Whether YouTube tries to stick on some ads against my wishes, I can't say, but I turn off all the ads. Oh, that was what I was going to say. I posted on Facebook a message too. The one thing that I think could use to be said more is the other side of it. That's why I brought up Jason Perez, because I said, as a comment to that video many months ago, I said, you know, the path of Patreon, of getting direct support, there's nothing special about Patreon. I don't have any care about the company any other way. My point is just direct support from the people watching the content or getting the art or whatever, if you're a writer or whatever. That is such a healthy relationship, the idea that the audience is funding it, because then all the incentives are aligned to do a good, honest job of reviewing content for the audience. But the thing that doesn't get said enough, and I think like all the new people who want to make their YouTube channels, when they look at other YouTube people who are saying, here's how to succeed, all those other YouTubers saying how to succeed are some combination of here's the way you make good thumbnails to get views and catchy stuff, and here's how you make money. And I think we need a little bit of a reality check. There need to be more voices saying, hey, there is some real joy, satisfaction, and enjoyment at having a YouTube channel whose goal is not to make money. There is a huge amount of fun, satisfaction that can be had by making YouTube your hobby and not trying to maximize your profits, not worrying about making money. Just treat it like any other hobby. It's not supposed to make you money. You're getting different enjoyment out of it. So that's the thing that I think is missing a few more voices saying, hey, don't try to make money off this. The same way you don't try to make money when you go play board games. You go play board games because you're having fun playing board games. Not because you're trying to make money, or not because you're trying to like spread the word of board games and get more people into the hobby. Stop trying to be something. So make this your life. Make this your job. If you want to try to do that, fine. But there need to be a few more voices telling you, guess what? If you don't try to make this your job, you might have a lot more fun. You might find that it's really something enjoyable. Okay, enough preaching. Let's get started reading our letter today. Only because it's Sunday. I try not to talk this much on our normal playthroughs, but let's see what the chat has to say. All right, so I've always believed if you take a review copy from a publisher or retailer, you're obligated to say nice things and too few bad things. Yeah, it's not really even obligations. And people can have the best of intentions not to be biased, but the brain doesn't work that way. The brain doesn't work that way. Dee says, unfortunately, we live in a time where everyone's trying to monetize every single thing. It's so true, and it's not healthy. Have fun, meet people. There you go. Okay, well, every time I do a live stream on this channel, especially if I do some 8-hour live stream, when it's over, I think, how lucky am I? How appreciative am I to have such a good group of people join me here? I really feel like I'm left out. Can we monetize watching YouTube streams, says Rob. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. There are certainly people getting paid to watch ads, etc. Okay, so letter 3. Let me just turn on the air conditioning here a little bit. Letter 3. Now, do we need to recap our previous letter at all? Let me just go over it very quickly. And let me go over the notes from people who had theories and questions. So our preacher went to investigate. He went to take a look at the scene. He heard about the body. There's a description of the body from our guy, and he says no more rigor mortis, caked in mud. Even his shoes had become scuffed. So this was one of the things and it had a reddish tint. This was one of the things in the discussion, which was there's little rigor mortis. And do we think that's a clue that something's wrong with the timeline? I don't think it is. He says he didn't get around to it till the morning after the accident. And my understanding from reading is that after 24 hours, rigor mortis could be completely gone. And The cave-ins seemed to happen yesterday in the close to the evening or late afternoon. So I think that feels like that's not a strict conflict timeline. In other words, it doesn't prove that he was killed 2 days previously. Okay, then Dewey, who we're all very suspicious of, he's walking around having bought a new race horse for 300 pounds, which is a huge amount of money he's recently come into. Makes us more suspicious of Dewey. All right. Then they go take a trip to the scene. They find outside the cave, it's littered with rubbish and tools, most of which lie rusting on the ground, and only one tent. Now, this is very suspicious because of what we're going to hear in a second. Are these just the climbing tools? I mean, the archaeology group has all gone home. It's over after the accident, but yet there's still a tent and there's still lots of rubbish and tools, and they gather it all up together. Not much talk about it, but more mention that this cave looks like it was right around some druid's temple, old. They go in there, it smells very pungent, arboreal odor, trees, odor of sort of plants and trees. They go into it, they find they find signs of this Celtic religion. It's the mother, it's a burial chamber. The religious people would make offerings there for hundreds of years. They go deeper, they see the cave goes through tunnels, then it opens up to this giant vaulted ceiling that's open at the top, water dripping into a large pool. They see signs that the group was going to try to get stuff out of the pool. There's buckets and stuff. We're told more about how they called for a grappling hook. Dewey ran out. The person heard the Professor Payne come walking in. It sounded like he slipped on something, that he hit his head. Okay, then they leave, they walk, and this was another question in the Discord, how close this Dewey's farm is to this cave, but it's quite a whiles away. It's like 20-30 minute walk. They see they're on the eve of Halloween, but they see a religious ceremony. And there's a cloaked figure leading a group of 13 in chants, and they hear them talking about this cult, which matches the statue in the cave. It's a chant about "Let me come home to mother," and 13 people around a well. They drop things in the well. What do they drop? They're in robes. They drop some fruit, but they also dropped rusted swords and axes, 3 of each, and they dropped plants in there. So notice how well this matches up with what was found outside the cave. Rusted instruments, a smell of arboreal rot. I mean, it really sounds like this cave and the statue of the mother is one of the places where this cult drops their things and has their ceremony. And who did they see running this ceremony? It's Dewey. Dewey, the local guide, is the leader of this little cult. They see him take out a knife, drag it across his left forearm, blood comes out. He says, "Take my blood and body." And then our guy, the preacher, and the delivery man talk about this cult, and he says they have this belief about water. Water's a portal between worlds. And remember, there was a pool of water in the cave. So there's a real connection between this cult and their offerings and the cave where the accident happened. Then our guy lastly goes into London to check in on the wife of the professor and the co-worker of the professor, and they're all kind of suspicious. Like, it seems clear the wife's having an affair with the reporter, and the co-worker is now going to take over the archaeology department and the Celtic antiques. There's this interesting little word issue here where we ask one of the guys who's now going to run the department, we say, hey, did you get anything out of there? And he says, let me see, tells us about the scene of the accident. He slipped on something. We ask if any artifacts came out, and he says the entire dig was mangled. Mort is barely tolerable, the guy who died. When things are going well, he's beastly when there's a hint of inconvenience. Maybe a little sign that maybe this guy who died was giving everyone a hard time. And then he says, was treasure found at the watery grotto? And this guy says, and I just noticed this when I reread it, we say, was any treasure found? And he says, I assure you, nothing of historical relevance was brought from the cromlech. So he doesn't say they didn't find anything. He just says, we didn't bring anything out. So there you have it. So if I look at the questions that we have, one is, are the pile of rusted items outside the cave and the one tent, are those signs that Dewey is bringing valuables out of there? They look like rusted nothing, but there may be rusted antique swords of value, and is he selling them for money? Is that how he got his money? Did he kill the professor and cause the cave-in on his own because they had stumbled into one of his religious temples? If so, why is he stealing out stuff and selling it? Is he a charlatan or is he a true believer? It certainly looked like he was a true believer, but if he was, would he really be selling it for money and betting on the horses? Or was something else going on where this whole group conspired to kill the professor for some reason? Is there a time of death discrepancy? We've gone over that. What's Dewey's motive? Is it money or religion? Is the smell in the cave a clue that they were using it to dump stuff? Okay. Those are my questions. There's our recap. Let's read the current letter. Finally, half hour in. November 4th. When was our last letter? November 1st. Okay, 3 days later. Dear Mr. Holmes, today I have much news to impart. I have been able to speak at length with Fiona Payne, Dylan Dewey, and others regarding Mr. Payne's death. In spite of this, I find myself uncertain as ever as to what occurred to the man. When I arrived at the Payne residence in Belgravia this morning, I was greeted by a maid, Becky, who showed me into the parlor where Fiona Payne was waiting. Her stark morning attire did not diminish her beauty. She had long ginger hair, which made me recall something said by an American author I admire. While the rest of the species is descended from apes, redheads are descended from cats. Sitting before me, she exuded a stern, uncompromising look of sovereignty. Our conversation began amiably enough. I expressed my condolences as tea was brought in. How long were you and your husband married? Came my first inquiry. Nearly 2 years, she told me. We met at the museum. I was a librarian in the Celtic and European section. I asked her if it was the same position now held by Miss Wingate. She nodded. When I asked if she missed working at the museum, she informed me that she had earned a degree in Scottish and Celtic studies from the University of Edinburgh, and that she hoped to bring her knowledge and love of all things Celtic to their partnership. In the words of Mrs. Payne, she insisted that I should accompany Mortimer on his digs across Britain. When I surmised that it must have been exciting to be part of her husband's discovery, she grew solemn for a moment before she said, "Oh, there was a part of me that felt our excavations violated the sanctity of those ancient places. Not only our presence, but the circus atmosphere and the carousing." Remember, they did a lot of drinking outside that cave. "I felt this was the perfect opportunity to mention that I had learned that 5 or more bottles of whiskey were among the provisions for their camp." In the silence that followed, hairline cracks in her composure gave way to tears. "Oh, Mortimer was an alco," she cried. "Poor Fiona told the classic tale of a drunkard who gives way to bouts of anger, deteriorating hygiene, difficulties with colleagues. We fought," she confessed. "He said I was the cause of his drinking. His moods darkened, and he would become resentful of any men who dared approach me. I waited for her to suggest that his drunkenness caused the fall that killed him, but she did not. Instead, she turned her soft green eyes upon me and gently pulled down her ruffled collar to reveal her throat. It had faded, but was still plain to see, bruising a fair amount. "This is Mortimer's work," she said, a small tear in the corner of one eye. I let her have a moment before I pressed on. "I understand you remained in the camp while the men worked in the cromlech," I stated. She nodded. "How was it, then, that you learned of the cave-in?" She put her face in her hands, heaved, and began to sob. "I can't recall. For my part, I recalled a warning offered to me by a fascinating Russian novel I read this year. Never trust a woman's tears." And so I pressed on. "Was it when you were bringing provisions?" I questioned. "Lunch, possibly?" Without meeting my gaze, she said, "Yes, maybe. I can't recall." She then fell silent, and after some seconds lifted her head. Fiona's tears had stopped. Eyes wide, she muttered, "I feel so." "I understand," I said. "Just one more question." "Just one more question?" She nodded. "Rory Campbell accompanied Mortimer on the Almwich dig, and the one before in Torcellan." She fixed her posture. "So I assume you and Mr. Campbell are acquainted." Her eyes cast downward as I continued. "Would you consider him a friend?" She remained still. I did the same. "As you well know, Mr. Holmes, silence is not silent." When it became apparent that I was prepared to wait for an answer, she revealed that she had made Rory Campbell's acquaintance at the University of Edinburgh, where they were students. "He was among my few friends. It was a gay and wonderful time," she remarked, with a hint of melancholy. As I made to speak, the maid interrupted with a fresh teapot, and Fiona turned to her. "Becky, I'm feeling poorly. Please show this gentleman out." She turned back to me with a faint smile and finished. "I really do feel unwell. My apologies." Thus my time in London concluded. But Fiona's responses put me on a night train to Edinburgh to call upon Rory Campbell. It was my hope to speak with him as soon as possible so that I could thereafter finally pay Dylan Dewey another visit, hopefully in circumstances less conspicuous than those we last faced. The trip from King's Cross to Waverley afforded more hours of rest than I had imagined, yet my body remained tired. I had forgotten how unpleasant night trains can be if one does not have a berth. It was after some 8 or 9 hours that I awoke to the twilight breaking over Durham and spotted the cathedral and castle rising over rooftops, signs that my tedious journey was near an end. Departing the train, I treated myself to the full Scottish breakfast before finding my way to Cockburn Street and the offices of the Scotsman. I did not find Rory Campbell at his desk, and hoping to learn his whereabouts, I asked to see the editor of his publication, Mr. B. Ainsley. I thought introducing myself as an acquaintance of Mr. Campbell might help me gain credibility, but it merited only a sad shake of Ainsley's head. I will spare you the tete-a-tete and simply tell you how Rory Campbell became part of Mortimer Payne's two most recent archaeological expeditions. When I inquired what interest the Scotsman had in an archaeological site in Almwich, the mystified editor said he knew nothing about it. Mr. Campbell had been on a hiking holiday as far as he knew. I countered with a similar question about the burial chamber excavation at Torcellan a year earlier. A look of recollection appeared on Mr. Ainsley's face as he told me that Campbell suggested the story to him. We often run stories to bolster Scottish pride and Celtic heritage, he said. If you're interested, we can find a copy of his story for you. I told him I would like to buy that edition and asked him to direct me to Mr. Campbell's residence. He chortled and told me I was unlikely to find him at home. He drinks at Mary King's pub nearby. The pub was just down the street. Only 3 patrons were in the tavern. 2 chatted at a table near the window, and 1 lean, red-headed man was slumped over the bar. I took a seat near him and bid him a good day. He turned his ginger, mustachioed face to me and returned my greeting with 2 words. You again. He signaled the barkeep, who came and poured him another. As the barman turned away, he stayed the man's arm. Donald, pour on one for the gent next to me. I stared at the amber liquor as it was poured into a glass set before me. Slink math, Campbell said, with his glass raised. I echoed his wish for my health and raised my glass. Cheers. Is your face better? I asked. Campbell raised his hand to the side of his neck. Just some bruises left is all. You have to finish my drink, he croaked. I told him I had 3 questions, and the first was about how Mortimer Payne met his death. I readied my pad and pencil and waited as he sipped from his glass. Mr. Campbell started. Happened on the 4th day, I think. Payne and Biddle's exploration attempts had been yielding impressive amounts of nothing, so I sat at the camp and bided my time at first. Then, on the 3rd or 4th day, the 2 archaeologists and their guide convinced themselves that a pool in the back of one of the tunnels held the promise of treasure. I went along, of course. Wasn't going to give them all the glory after 3 days at that awful camp. It happened while we were fishing about in that putrid water. Campbell stopped to think, then added, Payne tripped on a boulder, banged his head, dead before we realized what had occurred. I do not recall seeing any precariously positioned boulders near the grotto entrance, though it was exceedingly dark. Putting this, I posed my second question. How did the cave-in occur? Mr. Campbell appeared puzzled by this. Don't know. Could have been anything, save for that fool Dewey. The man acts as if he's holy. No, the holiest. But his mother may as well have named him Lord Mammon, always mucking about, shirking work. He drained his glass in one quaff and held it up, offering a crooked smile. I had the barkeep pour him another and asked my last question. I understand you and Fiona Payne are, well, how would you describe your relationship with Mrs. Payne? Rory slammed his glass on the bar so violently the whiskey splattered. We were friends. Friends at university, and I won't let you drag that lass into this fiasco. She suffered enough. He took what remained of his drink in one quaff and signaled for another. He was staring into his glass when I decided to follow with a more precarious line of inquiry. Did you kill Mortimer Payne? He didn't flinch. No, he answered, though someone should have a long time ago. Poor Fiona. I attempted to learn more. What about her? Did Fiona? He swiveled on his stool and grabbed the collar of my coat with such vehemence that the barkeep thrust his arm between us. It was a look of desolation, not rage, in his eyes when he said, "Let he who's without sin cast the first stone." Then he released me. There was nothing more for me in Aldreich, and I decided to start the long trip back to Almwich. It would be a tedious journey, but I had packed Doyle's latest, The Hound of the Baskervilles, in my bag, and an edition of the Scotsman I had purchased. Once on the train, I tended to business first and opened the yellowing edition that Campbell's editor had given me. On the front page, in all his gallantry, was Mortimer Payne. No doubt his ego grew by leaps when the story appeared, albeit not in a London paper. I thought to myself, Rory's ticket to the dig. After that, I was ready to crack the spine of that latest Sherlock Holmes novel, which was not unlike this case. As with Mortimer Payne's demise, Sir Charles Baskerville's death was a mystery, and a fellow named Mortimer, a grumpy neighbor who searches old tombs, brought the case to Holmes' attention. I dozed off after Act 2, where Watson discovers that Holmes had secretly come to the moors. I had wired ahead to Ellis Nichols, and true to his steadfast nature, he was waiting at Holyhead Station today as my train pulled in, with darlin' Rosie bouncing on the wagon seat. The curly-headed lass was one long string of questions all the way to Almwich. I was forced to recount my entire 2-day itinerary en route. Good practice before writing to you, I suppose. Okay, there's our last feat. Did I not read this side? No, I didn't even read this side. Okay. When I mentioned I had visited the British Museum, Rosie nearly bolted from her seat. "They have mummies, don't they?" she beamed. I confirmed her surmise with a nod, and her father and I quickly became the audience of a meticulous lecture concerning the mummy corpses, which Rosie explained are laid in salt for months before they are stuffed, with wine and spices, and then they're wrapped in linen. We learned of mummies until passing the schoolhouse, where we left Rosie. Afterwards, Ellis delivered me home to the parsonage. As payment for his kindness, I promised to prepare him a hearty meal on our arrival. Along the way, he told me that the usual news-mongering in Almwich has grown legs and made its way to Gwynedd. As it happens, a young lieutenant from North Wales Police Headquarters visited yesterday and talked to those involved in the rescue, including Ellis. "I told the officer no more than I told you," he said, slowing the wagon to a halt. Then turning to me, he confessed, "But, Father, I believe I have sinned." The thought of Ellis sinning, or rather what Ellis might consider to be a sin, was amusing, for he is a remarkably anxious man. So I put a sympathetic hand on his shoulder and asked what he had done. "Nothing I did, Father," he replied. "'Twas something I failed to do. I didn't tell that copper-button policeman everything. I didn't say a word about what I found at Mr. Payne's campsite." Finishing the sentence, he reached under his seat and produced a burlap sack, from which he retrieved an empty bottle of whiskey. I could not refrain from letting out a chuckle before consoling him. "It's already known," I said to Ellis, "that they were supplementing their expedition with generous amounts of spirits. You've done no wrong." But Ellis shook his head and merely twisted the bottle about in his hands. "Blood," he whispered, pointing to a spot on the bottle. I froze in place. Indeed, there was a translucent varnish, brown-red in color, staining one side of the bottle. Though I am far from an expert on such matters, I would hazard that the consistency of the stain is unlike that of whiskey or any liquor. Ellis told me that when he went to retrieve the tent and tools from around the cromlech, Mrs. Heather went with him to help clean up the area. It was she who found the bottle at the edge of a creek. Being a hard scrap farm woman, Catherine Heather had washed blood from tools and clothing many times and recognized its significance. As Ellis put the bottle back into the sack, he recalled that while the other 3 men they had rescued were dirty, they had only minor scrapes and bruises. None were bleeding. Only Mr. Payne, he noted, blood all over. I assured Ellis that I would send word of this bottle to not only the police, but also you. A short while after this, we had reached my rectory, eager for a warm meal. This meal was further forestalled, though, when we noticed a woman waiting in the garden as we approached. Once closer, we realized it was Miss Kate Heather. She appeared to be uneasy, but on seeing us, grinned and extended a basket of fruit, pears and apples. Reverend, I've thought of what occurred at the cavern a great deal, especially since finding that bottle with Ellis, and I'm afraid I still don't have much to offer. She paused. However, I have an acquaintance, Mrs. Beddoes, who used to pay her to lend a hand at the farmhouse. She uttered something curious to me yesterday. It was something innocent, but still it brought to mind Mr. Payne's expedition, and I feel compelled to tell you, for I do not know much of your investigation. I could be overlooking something incriminating about her. Mrs. Heather proceeded to explain a brief conversation she shared with Mrs. Beddoes near her farm yesterday. Her concern arises from statements the older woman made regarding the Payne expedition and the night of October 31st. Don't know why Dillon would think there was more to be found there. We searched the cromlech a month ago, so we'd be ready for All Hallows. Found plenty of rusty weapons in the water, and we offered 'em back to the gods at the ceremony. He'd have known there'd be nothing. In addition to this, Mrs. Heather urged me to take record of several phrases she overheard, exchanged by Mrs. Fiona Payne and Rory Campbell at her home on the day of the incident. When all this happened, it seemed like the sorts of things anyone might say after an accident, Mrs. Heather explained. So I didn't think it was important to let you know specifically, but I did overhear Mrs. Payne and the reporter while she sobbed in his arms. What stands out to me now was some words about the cost of their journey. Mrs. Payne was buried in his chest, but I could hear her saying, the dig already cost us so much. Then Mort goes and now this, we'll have nothing. Reverend, I confess I didn't hear some words in between, but I've a mind like a steel trap. Those words she undoubtedly said. Mrs. Heather drew a long breath and sighed. That seems odd to you too, no? I refrained from confirming or denying her suspicions, but like Mrs. Heather, I cannot help but wonder about Mrs. Payne's statements. Once Ellis and I saw off my unexpected guest, we finally indulged ourselves in a healthy platter of roast beef and carrots. For dessert, courtesy of Mrs. Kate Heather, fresh pears and apples. This we followed with one last expedition for the day to Dillon Dewey's family holdings. Ellis offered to accompany me since he had ventured there with me on the last occasion. I obliged. We were greeted by 2 of his land spaniels after another somewhat arduous wagon ride. They enthusiastically herded us toward the barn. Nearby, we observed his sheep gleaning the surrounding fields. The barley crop had been harvested months ago. At the barn, Dillon was seated on a low 3-legged stool, trimming sheep's hooves. His dogs had alerted him, so he was unsurprised and continued working as we entered. Dillon wore heavy leather gloves and held the leg of one of the sheep in one hand and a sharp curved knife in the other, cutting away the edges of a hoof. Without lifting his eyes from the work, he barked, "Hello!" We responded with our hellos, and he asked, "I suppose this is about the cock-up at the cromlech." "Are you a drinking man?" I responded. He stopped working at the hoof and looked up. "I am at times, but never when the job demands sobriety." When I mentioned that I had learned that 6 bottles of whiskey had been among the provisions for 5 persons, his nostrils flared and he squinted at Ellis. He dropped the lamb and stood, shaking his knife. He said, "It were a bloody proper sacrilege, drinking and carrying on in that hallowed place. They're lucky the ghasts only took pain." His shoulders relaxed and he plopped down onto a stool. "So be it. Now I have no more time for idle chatter." Ellis looked to me before making to leave, but I held my ground. "How did the cave-in happen?" Dillon shrugged. "I was told you went for more tools." Oh, no, we say. Dillon shrugged. "I was told you went for more tools or other provisions and inadvertently caused it." His reply was terse. "I know what I'm doing in those caverns." I moved closer. Then it was a miracle you were not crushed in it." "It was not my Dan," he replied, as he again seized the lamb's leg, flipped it on its back, and set his blade to work. This word, I understand, can mean many things. Poetry, destiny, art are among them to people like Dillon. I thanked him. "Diolch, we'll be on our way." But before exiting the barn along with Ellis, I turned back and exclaimed, "Oh, how could I forget to congratulate you? Your good fortune." At last, Dillon looked directly to me. I added, "I'm speaking of your purchase of Victory Song. Though I cannot be certain it's a good way to invest an unexpected bounty." This comment brought him to his feet in a manner that compelled Ellis to step between us. Dillon's hackles quickly receded, and he put on a smile. "The gods confer blessings as well as curses," he quipped. "Act as the gods do on behalf of the gods, and be rewarded as such." And there you have it, my dear Holmes. Some details continue to elude this poor country pastor, but I must concede that Mortimer Payne's death seems to be the result of something far beyond an unforeseen collapse. Of course, you will be a better judge. May God rest Mr. Payne's soul whilst we seek justice on this earth. I await your perspective and advice. Evermore yours in the Lord, Reverend Dorian Skinner. Okay, let me file these away while I hear from the chat what you guys picked up and if anything sheds light on this case. Surely you picked up something. I mean, that's not a trick question. I'm not sure I noticed anything dramatic here. The most interesting thing from my perspective was Heather's maid's comments. Okay, so let me go back and circle the things that were significant. He goes to meet with the wife, and she says he was an alcoholic and abused her. And she's having an affair, clearly. And she won't say how how she knew about the cave-in. That's very suspicious. He was an alcoholic, and he had choked her, and he gets violent when he drinks. We say, how did you know about the collapse? And she can't remember. That's ridiculous. Then we ask her if she's having an affair, and she says it's time for you to leave. Then we try to find Rory Campbell to find out. We find his editor, who tells us he wasn't on a job reporting something. He was just taking vacation. He was on there on his own, which is very fishy. He's a drinker too. Seems like he's his own alcoholic. And when we ask him what happened, he says he tripped on a boulder and banged his head. Well, that doesn't really make sense, because we know the injury was to the back of his head. We ask about him and Fiona, and he gets angry, and then we just leave. And then this guy shows us the bottle they found with blood. So this is the murder that we're fairly sure of right from the beginning. Someone hit him in the back of the head with a bottle. All right. Now, this was the interesting part to me. The person who owned the farm where they came to get help tells us stuff she overheard. And one thing she overheard is that she says, I don't know why Dylan would be leading them into this temple thinking there were valuables here. Because she's obviously part of this cult religion. Because she says, hey, we were there last month. We searched the whole thing. And we did find plenty of rusty weapons, which we brought back and used in a ceremony. He knows there's nothing valuable in that temple. Now, this is huge, because this was a major theory of ours, that Dylan Dewey killed Payne because he had stumbled into this temple with treasures. But now it seems very clear that there's nothing of value actually in here. And then she overhears them talking about how the cost of their journey, it did cost us so much. And she says, then Mort goes and ... And now this. We'll have nothing. So money troubles. Then we talk to Dewey, who says the ghost took Payne. They're lucky. That's all he took. How did the cave-in happen? Our guy Dewey says, I know what I'm doing in the caverns. I would never cause an accidental cave in. I know what I didn't hit anything. I didn't cause it. And then why weren't you crushed? He says it wasn't my fate. And then Ellis asks him about the money he came into to buy his horse, and the guy gets upset at him. All right. Melissa says he wasn't a good person, was hurting a lot of people. Maybe they ganged up on him. That was one of our early theories, and that they paid Dewey, and I think that's looking much more likely now. Blood on the bottle outside. They killed him outside, dragged him into the cave. That's why the body is muddy. Not only is the body muddy, but the shoes are all scuffed up from being dragged in. The cave-in is a cover-up. I think that it is looking more likely that what happened was they were all drinking. He was on a binge, and someone hit him on the back of the head, probably the wife. And then they've all agreed they're going to cover it up. They've paid off Dewey, bribed him to cover it up. I don't even think it probably wasn't even premeditated, maybe. Just he got violent, maybe in an argument about how he was losing them all money, or caught his wife cheating, and the wife probably hit him on the back of the head hard with the bottle, and he fell backwards, hit his head on a rock, died, and they decided as a group to make it look like he was killed in the cave. So they dragged him in, which is why his shoes are all scuffed up. Dropped him in and then caused the cave-in. All agreed on the story. And they paid off Dewey. And the rest of them don't need to be paid off because Rory Campbell is doing it because he's having an affair with the wife. The other guy is doing it because he's going to inherit his job. And maybe this explains a little bit of the rigor mortis concern, because it means he was killed earlier in the morning, which gives it more time for the body to come out of rigor mortis, rather than at the time of the actual cave-in. Makes sense. Here's the part about scuffed shoes. He was caked in mud. Even Mr. Payne's shoes had become horribly scuffed. I think that's your theory of him being dragged into the cave. And I think him being killed outside of the cave makes a little more sense in terms of it not being premeditated, if that's our theory. Are we told where she found the bottle? It was she who found the bottle at the edge of a creek. So I think this is important because when I read that, I sort of took it to mean that someone had killed him in the cave with the bottle and then thrown the bottle at the edge of the creek. But that doesn't make that much sense. If you were going to dispose of the bottle, you would throw it far into the water or something. This makes a little more sense that what happened was he was hit on the head by his wife at the creek while he was choking her. Or maybe Rory hit him on the head while she was being choked, but whatever. The point is that that happened there at the creek, and then they had to figure out how to make it look like an accident. Dewey could be blackmailing the murderer. That's how he got the money. Well, whether it's blackmail or bribery, it's basically still the same idea that they're paying him off to be part of this, and probably promising to never come back here. Now, what about this? Do you think maybe this is talking about the money they're going to have to pay Dewey? She says, the dig cost us so much. Then Mort goes and now this. We'll have nothing. I wonder if she's not talking about like the dig costs us so much. I wonder if they actually, I wonder if what happened is they came out of the temple having found nothing and he got angry. I wonder if this is her saying like, and now we've agreed to pay Dewey 300 pounds. DJ Moneycut reminds us the reporter had a cut on his cheek at the funeral. He was probably defending the wife. That makes some sense. That makes some sense. And I do think they might be talking about the fact that they're going to have no money because the dig cost them the money, and now they're going to have to pay off Dewey. So this is our theory B, that they're all in it on it together, and Dewey has been paid off by them, but not paid to kill him, just paid to keep quiet. And they've also let him walk away as a hero, right? Running back into the cave. All right, I think we have a pretty good theory here. I feel pretty good about it. Is there anything that contradicts our theory? It might even explain the rigor mortis being all but gone because he was killed earlier. I love the I think it was whoever it was it DJ Moneycut who says they dragged him into the cave? I love the little clue about the scuffed shoes. That feels right to me. That the shoes got scuffed when they dragged him in. I think it's also interesting that they all come up with a story that he slipped, but the stories are slightly different. Like they haven't gotten it fully lined up. One's like he tripped on a boulder, one is he slipped on something I didn't hear. One guy says he tripped on a boulder and hit his head. Melissa says, what about the two that were found hiding scared in the corner of the cave? Well, that's a good point. It does sound like those two people were actually trapped in the cave. That is a little bit of a hole in the theory. Maybe it was planned to look like they were trapped, but they really weren't. But that is a good example of something that's a little inconsistent with our theory. If the other two really were trapped in the cave, that would, but maybe that was part of the plan. They had to make it look like they were trapped in there. So they found some safe place to hide. Is the old lady mentioned in this letter the same one who cursed Payne at the beginning, Mrs. Betty's? I don't think so. I don't think so. No reason to think that. I think the biggest concern on our part should be the point that Melissa is making about the two that were found in the cave and that were dug out. Let's read that part again. The rescue took 3 hours to gather the men, the pickaxe. The entrance was narrow. Took them another 4 hours to make their way. They called out. They didn't hear anything. This compelled Ellis and one other man to enter with lanterns. Thereafter, they spotted Professor Biddle and Rory Campbell cowering in one of the tunnels alongside a far wall. The rescuers had to personally lead them back out into the camp because the lantern's light was too bright, painful to their eyes. They were quite disoriented. So how do we explain this with our theory that they staged the death? Wouldn't they have put the body, dragged it in, staged the collapse? Surely they would not themselves go into the cave while it was collapsed. That would be far too risky if they were purposefully collapsing it. Unless this is just they're deceiving them, they're making it look like they were trapped beneath the rubble, but maybe they were just in a different, in an uncollapsed branch. Dewey knows the caves well, so maybe he knew they would be safe in that spot. Yeah, that would be my best guess. Or maybe Dewey knows a back door. I mean, yeah, my guess is that sort of they caused the cave in, and then Dewey showed them where to hide. And maybe they were scared after all, but I still think that's our best theory. I suppose you could even come up with a theory that said something like their plan was to drag him in the cave, make it look like he fell and hit his head, and that the cave-in was an accident. But our theory is sort of that Dewey is making it look, taking advantage of it. So I'm not sure. Well, why don't we stop here? We'll still have time to discuss final theories before we read the solution from Holmes next week. You can stop by the Discord to chat more about it. Spend this week thinking if you have any other theories. We'll meet next Sunday at 1 p.m. normal time. We'll have a last-minute discussion of any final ideas before we read the solution from Holmes. I'll see you all next week.